The producer waved him off mid-verse. 10-year-old Michael was halfway through the song, microphone tight in his hand, when he stopped, turned around, and asked one question that made everyone in that studio realize they weren't working with a child anymore. The silence that followed wasn't hesitation. It was respect. It was a Tuesday afternoon in late 1968. The studio wasn't fancy. Just 4 walls, decent soundproofing, and a console that hummed when you pushed it too hard. The carpet was worn near the door. The foam on the mic windscreen had yellowed. But the acoustics were clean. Michael had been standing at the mic for 40 minutes. His brothers were outside in the waiting area. Jermaine had fallen asleep with his head against the wall. Tito kept checking the clock. Jackie was tapping his foot, not to any rhythm, just nervous energy. The air smelled like coffee and old carpet. The clock on the wall ticked louder than it should have. Inside, it was just Michael, the producer, a man named Frank with graying temples and a coffee stain on his shirt, and 2 engineers who'd seen 1,000 kids come through that door. One of them, Eddie, had a notebook open. He was supposed to be logging takes, but for the last 10 minutes he'd just been watching. His pen hadn't moved. His eyes hadn't left the glass. Frank had heard the demo tape. Clean harmonies, tight vocals, something special in the lead. But a tape's one thing. A live take's another, and kids get nervous. Kids forget the melody. Frank had worked with plenty of child acts. Most were gone within a year. The ones who lasted had something you couldn't teach. 20 minutes until the tour manager arrives. That's what Frank had said. The tour manager decided if the act went on the road or went back to Gary, Indiana. The clock was counting down a future. The first take was fine. The second was better. The third had a timing issue. Michael came in half a beat early on the bridge. Frank stopped the tape, rewound it, and said, "Again." Michael nodded. No complaint. No question. Most kids would have asked why. Michael just reset. The fourth take was the one. Michael hit every note. The phrasing was clean. The breath control for a 10-year-old was unnatural. Frank leaned back and let the last note ring out. One of the engineers looked up and raised an eyebrow. That was the keeper. The reverb faded. The tape rolled for 3 more seconds. Frank hit stop. Frank stood up, stretched, and waved towards the door. "Good, we're done. Go get your brothers." That's when Michael stopped him. He didn't shout, he didn't move toward the glass. He just turned, still holding the mic, and said, "Can I hear it back?" The room went still, not quiet, still, like the air itself had stopped moving. Frank blinked. "What?" "Can I hear it back?" Michael repeated. His voice was calm, even. No emotion, just a question. But the way he asked it, like he already knew the answer should be yes, shifted something in the room. Frank glanced at the engineers. One of them shrugged. The other one smiled. Barely, but it was there. Frank scratched the back of his neck and said, "Kid, we don't usually—" "I just want to hear it," Michael said. Once. Frank could have said no. He could have reminded Michael they were on a schedule, but something in the way Michael stood there, mic still in hand, eyes steady, no pleading, made Frank sit back down. It wasn't the request, it was the certainty behind it. That kind of confidence doesn't come from ego. It comes from knowing your own work. "Fine," Frank said. Once. He hit rewind. The tape spun backward with that thin, high-pitched whine. Then he pressed play. The speakers crackled. The intro started. Bass line first, then drums, then the guitar riff. And then Michael's voice came in. Everyone in that room had heard it 60 seconds ago. But hearing it back, through the monitors with the reverb and compression, was different. It sounded older. Like someone who'd been singing for 20 years, not 10. The low end sat perfectly. The high notes cut through without being sharp. Michael stood in the booth, head tilted slightly, eyes closed. He wasn't moving. He was just listening. His lips moved once, barely, on the second verse, like he was checking something. Eddie stopped writing. He looked at Frank. Frank was watching Michael through the glass. So was Ron, who'd worked with Motown acts. Ron had his arms crossed, but he was leaning forward now. Something had shifted in the room. The air felt different, heavier. When the playback ended, Michael opened his eyes. He didn't smile. He didn't ask if it was good. He just looked at Frank through the glass and said, "The second verse. I came in too soft." Frank blinked. "What?" "Second verse," Michael said. "I pulled back. I shouldn't have." Eddie leaned forward and checked the waveform. He scrolled back, isolated the verse, played it again. Headphones on, eyes closed. Then he looked at Ron. Ron nodded once. Eddie wrote something in his notebook. Then he underlined it twice. Michael was right. The dynamic had dipped. Not enough to ruin the take, but enough that it wasn't perfect. And Michael, 10 years old, standing in a vocal booth, had caught it on the first playback. Frank stared at the kid for 5 full seconds. Then he pressed the talkback button and said, "You want to do it again?" "Yes," Michael said. 15 minutes, half the session gone. Frank reset the tape. Michael stepped back to the mic. No warm-up, no water. He adjusted his headphones once, then nodded. The 5th take started the same. Same intro, same timing. But when the second verse hit, Michael leaned into it. Not louder, just present. The difference was maybe 2 decibels, but it was there. Eddie stopped writing. Ron uncrossed his arms. Frank sat perfectly still. When it ended, Frank didn't stand up. He just sat there, hands folded, staring at the console. Ron said, "That's the one." Frank nodded. He pressed the talkback. "Yeah, that's the one." Michael set the mic back on the stand, gently, and stepped towards the door. When the tour manager arrived 10 minutes later, Frank played him both takes. The tour manager, a man named Carl with a briefcase, listened with his arms crossed, face blank. He'd signed acts before. He'd passed on acts that became legends. When it ended, he looked at Frank and said, "Which one's the single?" Frank pointed at the 5th. "That one. Why?" "Because the kid heard something we didn't." Carl looked at him. "The kid?" 10 years old. Asked to hear the playback, caught a flaw, fixed it in 1 take. Carl pulled out a contract and signed it. Then he looked at Frank and said, "You keeping him?" "If I can," Frank said. Carl nodded and walked out. 3 weeks later, Michael was on a tour bus heading to Detroit. 6 months later, he was in a bigger studio with gold records on the wall. A year later, people who'd never heard of Gary, Indiana, knew his name. The question was simple. Can I hear it back? Most kids trust the adults in the room, but Michael didn't assume. He needed to hear it himself. That's not distrust, it's ownership. The question wasn't about ego, it was about accountability. At 10 years old, Michael understood something most professionals twice his age never learn. The performance doesn't end when you stop singing. It ends when you know it's right. Frank kept that 5th take in his archive for years. He'd tell the same story. Kid was 10, asked to hear it back, heard a flaw I missed, fixed it, 1 take. And every time, someone would ask, how did he know? Frank would shrug and say, some people hear it, some people don't. But the real answer was that Michael demanded the chance to hear it. That standard became the foundation of everything that came after. Every album, every tour, every moment that made the world stop. It was set by a 10-year-old who refused to walk out until he knew the work was right. Years later, Michael said, "I always listened. I didn't just sing and leave, I listened, because if I didn't, who would?" It wasn't about impressing anyone. It was about holding himself to a standard no one else was asking him to meet. A standard that became legendary not because it was imposed, but because it was chosen. 10 minutes after the tour manager left, Michael sat in the hallway, back against the wall, eyes closed. His brothers had gone outside. The hallway was quiet. Down the hall, someone was warming up on a piano. But Michael didn't hear it. He was still in that booth, still listening. Frank walked past. He stopped and said, "You good?" Michael opened his eyes. "Yeah, I'm good. That thing you did in there, asking to hear it back, keep doing that." Michael looked up. "Okay? I mean it, don't stop doing that." Michael nodded. Frank walked out, and Michael sat there for another 5 minutes, the fifth take still, playing in his head. That session became a reference point. Producers learned fast. If Michael asked to hear it back, you played it back. If he said something was off, you checked, because 9 times out of 10, he was right. The fifth take became the single. The single became a hit. The hit became a career. The career became history. But the foundation? That happened in a studio with worn carpet, when a 10-year-old asked one question most adults are too afraid to ask. One question. From a 10-year-old kid who refused to walk out until he knew the work was right. That's not talent, that's integrity. And integrity, at 10 years old in a room full of adults who thought they knew better, is what separates a moment from a legacy. The silence that followed wasn't hesitation. It was respect.